The belief in progress has been at the center of modern European thought since the scientific revolution of the 17th century. Although some Romantic poets, conservatives, and socialists questioned the consequences of modern technologies and industry, most people in the 19th century assumed that progress was both inevitable and beneficial. Liberals were especially optimistic about progressive developments in all the main spheres of modern life: scientific knowledge, technological inventions, economic expansion, constitutional government, and protection for fundamental human rights. But the liberals were by no means alone in seeing the late 19th century European ascendancy as the historical confirmation of human progress. There were also many Europeans, however, who protested that whole groups of human beings were still denied the benefits of modern civilization, that workers were not receiving their rightful share of modern wealth, or that women were not entering their rightful place in modern political life. New political movements in these decades therefore sought to expand the economic and legal rights of workers and women, claiming that such reforms would advance the broader cause of social progress. And in fact, the new political movements were often able to gain new rights or benefits for the groups they represented. Meanwhile, science itself continued to produce advances in both the theoretical understanding of nature and the technological inventions that were transforming modern societies. Yet it was also at this time that various thinkers began to question the certitudes of scientific knowledge and to stress the limits of human reason, thus challenging many of the cultural assumptions that sustained the popular belief in human progress. These new trends in European intellectual life before 1914 began to erode some of the confidence in the progressive evolution of human history, at least among certain philosophers or artists, and to undermine the optimism of classical liberalism. The idea of progress remained a powerful theme in all modern cultures. But by the early 20th century, the limits and consequences of progress were also becoming subjects for historical reflection, artistic representation, and cultural debate. 625 11109 72. The advance of democracy, socialism, labor unions, and feminism. The artisan and laboring classes had always been suspicious of bourgeois liberalism's optimistic view of free competition, unrestrained private enterprise, the Manchester School, laissez-faire, the laws of supply and demand, the free market for goods and labor, and the idea of an economy independent of states and governments. These were the ideas of middle-class liberals, not of radical Democrats. Popular leaders had opposed them in the French Revolution in 1793. The English Chartists had been outspokenly anti-capitalistic, and on the continent, the ideas of socialism had been spreading. In 1848, there was a strong movement among the working classes for a social republic, and though the social revolution failed in 1848, the force of it was enough to terrify the possessing classes. With the advent of the ballot, workers pressed for social legislation and used their political power to gain a greater measure of social democracy. Opponents of liberalism, 1110. But in addition, before and after obtaining the ballot, working people resorted to other devices for the improvement of their position. Against the owners of capital, who controlled the giving of jobs, workers advocated two principal lines of action. Some believed they could and should abolish the capitalist economic system. Others believed they should bargain with their capitalist employers. The former view led to radical forms of socialism, the latter to the formation of labor unions. Socialism, in logic, meant the extinction of the private employer as such, or at least to the dissolution of the larger capitalist corporations. Trade unionism, in logic, meant that the workers had every reason to keep their employers prospering in business, in order that bargaining with them might produce better economic results. The working class movement thus contained an internal conflict, or contradiction, that was never resolved in the 19th century, and that would become even more divisive after the Russian Revolution in the early 20th century. Middle-class and educated people who took up the workers' cause, the intellectuals of the movement, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Louis Blanc, Ferdinand Lassalle, and thousands of less famous names, tended more to socialism than to unionism. They thought of society as a whole, they saw the economy as a complex social system, and they thought of future changes in long-run terms that allowed for whole historical epochs to come and go. Most actual workers put to work at an early age, barely educated if at all, with the waking hours of their adult lives spent on manual jobs, were inclined to keep their attention more on the benefits of unionism than on the theories of socialism. To earn slightly more money every week beginning next week, to be spared the nervous strain and physical danger of constant exposure to unprotected machinery, to have 15 minutes more every day for lunch, were likely to seem more tangible and important than far-reaching but distant plans for a reconstructed society. The worker looked on the intellectual as an outsider, however welcome. The intellectual looked on the worker as short-sighted and timid, however much in need of help. Workers and intellectuals. After the failures of 1848, the socialist and trade union movements diverged for a generation. The 1850s, compared with the Hungry 40s, were a time of full employment, rising wages, and increasing prosperity for all classes. Workers set to organizing unions, socialist thinkers to perfecting their doctrines. 626. The trade union movement and rise of British labor 11 and 11. Organizations of wage workers, or labor unions in the modern sense, as distinguished from medieval craft guilds, had long maintained a shadowy and sporadic existence, but they had always been extra-legal, frowned upon, or actually prohibited by governments. French revolutionaries in the Le Chapelier Act of 1791 and conservative British Tories in the Combination Act of 1799 had shared similar goals in forbidding workers to unite. It was the rise of bourgeois liberalism, so insensitive to the worker in most ways, that first gave legal freedom to labor unions. The British unions received a tacit recognition from the Liberal Tories in 1825 and explicit recognition from Gladstone's Liberal Ministry in 1871. French unions were recognized by Napoleon III in 1864, then restrained in the reaction to the Radical Commune, then fully legalized in 1884. In Germany, Bismarck negotiated with labor leaders to find support against the vested interests that stood in his way. The prosperity of the 1850s favored the formation of unions, for workers could always organize more easily when employers were most in need of their services. The craft union, or union of skilled workers in the same trade, such as carpenters, was at first the typical organization. It was most fully developed in England, where a new model unionism was introduced by the Amalgamated Society of Engineers, i.e., machinists, in 1851. It was the policy of the new model union officials to take the unions out of politics, to forget the semi-socialism of the Chartists, to abandon Robert Owen's grandiose idea of one big union for all workers, and to concentrate on advancing the interests of each separate trade. The new leaders proposed to be reasonable with employers, avoid strikes, accumulate union funds, and build up their membership. This strategy was successful. The unions took root, and the two governing parties in England, reassured by the unexpected moderation of working-class representatives, combined to give the vote to town workers in 1867. New model unionism. In the 1880s, and especially with a Great London Dock Strike in 1889, which closed the Port of London for the first time since the French Revolution, unions of unskilled workers began to form. Industrial unionism, or the joining in one union of all workers in one industry, such as coal or transportation, regardless of the skill or job of the individual worker, began to take shape at the same time. In some cases, the older skilled unionists joined with unskilled laborers who worked beside them. By 1900, there were about 2,000 union members in Great Britain, compared with only 850,000 in Germany and 250,000 in France. It was largely because British workers were so far advanced in trade unionism and so successful in forcing collective bargaining upon their employers that they were much slower than their continental counterparts in forming a workers' political party. By the 1880s, when avowed socialists were already sitting in French, Belgian, and German parliaments, the only corresponding persons in Britain were a half-dozen Lib Labs, as they were called, laboring men elected on the Liberal ticket. The British Labour Party was formed at the turn of the century by the joint efforts of trade union officials and middle-class intellectuals. Where on the continent the labor unions were often led, and even brought into being, by the socialist political parties, in Britain it was the labor unions that brought into being, and subsequently led, the Labour Party. The influence of British labor unions made the Labour Party less socialistic than working-class parties on the continent. Its origin and rapid growth were due in large measure to a desire to defend the unions as established and respectable institutions. The British Labour Party, 627 in 11 and 13. A steady rise in the membership of labor unions transformed political life in all industrialized societies. This illustration of British miners voting to strike was published in an Italian newspaper, but it depicts the kind of worker activism that became common in most European nations and in other parts of the modern world during the early 20th century. DEAA, Dagli Orti, Getty Images. The unions were threatened in their very existence by a ruling of the British courts in 1901. The Taff Vale decision, which held a union financially responsible for business losses incurred by an employer during a strike. The shortest and most orderly strike, by exhausting a union's funds, might ruin the union. Opposition to the Taff Vale decision unified the unions and all other existing labor and socialist organizations and precipitated the formation of the modern Labour Party. In the election of 1906, the new Labour Party sent 29 members to Parliament, which thereupon overruled the Taff Vale decision by new legislation. The Labour Party also pushed the ruling Liberal Party to enact social legislation that gave workers new protections against illness, unemployment, and the post-employment vulnerabilities of old age described in the previous chapter. The Taff Vale Decision 1114 European Socialism, Aware 1850. As for socialism, which had so frightened the middle and upper classes in 1848, it seemed in the 1850s to go into abeyance. Karl Marx, after issuing the Communist Manifesto with Engels in 1848 and agitating as a journalist in the German Revolution of that year, withdrew to the secure haven offered by England, where, after years of painstaking research, he published the first volume of his Capital in 1867. This work, which later included 2 more volumes that were published after his death, gave economic details and new arguments to explain the broad ideas of the earlier Communist Manifesto. Marx lived for more than 30 years in London, but he scarcely mixed with the labor leaders then building up the English unions. He associated mainly with political exiles and temporary visitors of 628 in 1115 numerous nationalities, and the first volume of Capital was not even published in English until 1886. In 1864, there took place in London the first meeting of the International Working Men's Association, commonly known as the First International. It was sponsored by a heterogeneous group, including the secretary of the British Carpenters Union, Robert Applegarth, the aging Italian revolutionary, Mazzini, and Karl Marx. With the union officials absorbed in union business, leadership in the association gradually passed to Marx, who used it as a means of publicizing the ideas about to appear in his Capital. At subsequent annual congresses in other European cities, Marx built up his position. He made the Mazzinians unwelcome, and he denounced the German Lassallians for their willingness to cooperate with Bismarck and the German state. His sharpest struggle was with the Russian Bakunin. Drawing on his experience in Tsarist Russia, Bakunin viewed the state as the cause of the workers' afflictions. He was hence an anarchist, holding that the state should be attacked and abolished. To Marx, anarchism was abhorrent. The correct doctrine, in Marx's view, was that the state, Tsarist or bourgeois, was a product of economic conditions and a weapon of the propertied interests, so that the true target for revolutionary action must be not the state, but the capitalist economic system. Marx drove Bakunin from the First International in 1872. The First International. Meanwhile, members of the First International watched with great excitement as the Paris Commune emerged in 1871. They hoped that the new revolutionary events in Paris might be the opening act of a European working-class upheaval. Members of the International infiltrated the Commune, and the connection between the two, though rather incidental, was one reason why the French provisional government repressed the Commune with such terrified ferocity. But the Commune actually destroyed the First International. Marx praised the Commune as a stage in the international class war, and even as a possible example of what he was coming to call the dictatorship of the proletariat. He thus frightened away many possible followers. British trade unionists, for example, would never support such revolutionary doctrines or violence. The First International faded out of existence after 1872. The Paris Commune Lenin 16. But in 1875, at a German workers' conference in Gotha, Marxian and Lassallean socialists united to found the German Social Democratic Party, whose remarkable growth thereafter, against Bismarck's attempts to stop it, has already been noted. Other socialist parties soon sprouted in many European countries. In Belgium, highly industrialized, a Belgian Socialist Party appeared in 1879. In the industrial regions of France, some workers were attracted to Jules Gued, a self-taught worker, former communard, and now a rigid Marxist, who held it impossible to emancipate the working class by parliamentary compromises or piecemeal reforms. Others followed Paul Brousse, who thought workers could arrive at socialism through parliamentary methods. Still others supported Jean Jaurès, who eloquently linked social reform to the French revolutionary tradition and the defense of republican institutions. Not until 1905 did the socialist groups in France form a unified socialist party. In England, in 1881, H.M. Hinman founded a social democratic federation with a more radical Marxist program. It never had more than a handful of members. In 1883, two Russian exiles in Switzerland, Plekhanov and Axelrod, recent converts to Marxism, founded the Russian Social Democratic Party, from which the Russian communism of the following century would later evolve. The socialist parties all came together to establish a new international league in 1889, known as the Second International, which thereafter met every 3 years and lasted until 1914. The Second International 629 Revisionist and Revolutionary Socialism, 1880 to 1914, 1117. Marx died in 1883, but the new socialist parties of the 1880s were all Marxist in inspiration. Marxism, or scientific socialism, by the force of its social analysis, the mass of Marx's writings over 40 years, and an attitude of unyielding hostility to competing socialist doctrines, had gradually become the most influential form of systematic socialism. Strongest in Germany and France, Marxism was relatively less successful in Italy and Spain, where workers were less concentrated in large factories, generally less educated, and still unable to place their hopes in the ballot. Workers in Southern Europe were more habituated to insurrectionism in the manner of Garibaldi, and they turned more frequently to the anarchism preached by Bakunin. Marxism also attracted relatively little support from labor groups in England. The workers stood by their trade unions, and middle-class critics of capitalism followed the Fabian Society, established in 1883. The Fabians, so called from the ancient Roman general Fabius Cunctator, the delayer, or strategist of gradual methods, were very English and very un-Marxist. George Bernard Shaw, H.G., Wells, and Sidney and Beatrice Webb were among early members of the society. For them, socialism was the social and economic counterpart to political democracy, as well as its inevitable outcome. They believed that gradual and reasonable measures would in due time bring about a socialist state. Rejecting the idea that revolutionary violence would be needed to change the economic system, the Fabians argued that improvement of local government or municipal ownership of such things as waterworks and electric lighting were practical steps toward a more just society. The Fabians, like the trade union officials, were thus content with small and immediate satisfactions. They joined with the unions to form the Labor Party. At the same time, by patient and detailed research into economic realities, they provided a mass of practical information on which a legislative program could be based. Fabian socialism in England, 1118. The Marxist or social democratic parties on the continent grew rapidly in the decades after 1870. Marxism turned into a less revolutionary, parliamentary socialism, except indeed for the Russian Social Democratic Party, because Russia had no parliamentary government. The growth of socialist parties meant that true workers, and not merely intellectuals, were voting for socialist candidates for the Reichstag, Chamber of Deputies, or whatever the lower house of parliament might be called. And this in turn meant that the moderating influence of labor unions within the parties was increased. The workers and their union officials might, in theory, consider themselves locked in an enormous struggle with capital. But in practice, their aim was to gain more for themselves out of their employer's business. They might believe in the internationalism of the workers' interests, but in practice, acting through the parliaments of their various national states, they would work for orderly legislation that benefited the workers of their own countries. Social insurance, factory regulation, minimum wages, or maximum hours. Parliamentary socialism on the continent. By the close of the 19th century, it was becoming apparent that Marx's prediction of growing worker impoverishment, based initially on conditions of the 1840s, had not come true, at least not yet. The bourgeoisie was getting richer, but the proletarian was not getting poorer. Real wages, or what the wage earner's income would actually buy, even allowing for the losses due to unemployment, are estimated to have risen about 50% in the industrialized countries between 1870 and 1900. This increase was due to the greater productivity of labor through mechanization, the growth of the world economy. 630. The revisionists 1119, the accumulation of capital wealth, and the gradual fall in prices of food and other items that the workers had to buy. Marxism began in the 1890s to undergo a movement of revisionism that responded to a changing social environment. Workers could now gain somewhat better wages and also vote for new political parties that gave them more public influence. The revisionists were led in France by Jean Jaurès, socialist leader in the Chamber of Deputies, and in Germany by Eduard Bernstein, social democratic member of the Reichstag and author in 1898 of Evolutionary Socialism, an important tract setting forth the new views. The revisionists held that the class conflict might not be absolutely inevitable, that capitalism might be gradually transformed in the workers' interest, and that workers could now use the vote and their own political parties to improve their lives through democratic channels, without revolution and without any dictatorship of the proletariat. Most socialists or social democrats followed the revisionists. Repeatedly, but in vain, the Second International had to warn its component socialist parties against collaboration with the bourgeoisie. This tendency to opportunism among socialist political leaders drove the really revolutionary spirits into new directions. Thus, there arose revolutionary syndicalism, of which the main intellectual exponent was a Frenchman, Georges Sorel. Syndicalism is simply the French word for trade unionism, syndicat, a union, and the idea was that the workers' unions might themselves become the supreme authoritative institutions in society, replacing not only property and the market economy, but also government itself. The means to this end was to be a vast general strike, in which all workers in all industries would simultaneously stop work, thus paralyzing society and forcing acceptance of their will. Syndicalism made most headway where the unions were weakest, as in Italy, Spain, and France, because here the unions had the least to lose, and the more sensational doctrines helped to attract members. Syndicalism 1120. Among Orthodox Marxists, there was also a revival of Marxist fundamentals in protest against revisionism. In Germany, Karl Kautsky criticized the revisionists as compromisers who betrayed Marxism for petty bourgeois ends. In 1904, he and other rigorists prevailed upon the Second International to condemn the political behavior of the French socialist Alexandre Millerand, who in 1899 had accepted a ministerial post in a French cabinet. Socialists might use parliaments as a forum, the Second International ruled, but socialists who entered the government itself were unpardonably identifying themselves with the enemy bourgeois state. Not until the First World War did socialists henceforth join the cabinet of any European country. In the Russian Social Democratic Party, the issue of revisionism came to a head in 1903 at a party congress held in London, for the most prominent Russian Marxists were mainly exiles. Here, a group led by the committed revolutionist V.I. Lenin demanded that revisionism be stamped out. Lenin won a majority, at the moment at least, and hence the uncompromising Marxists were called Bolsheviks, from the Russian word for majority, while the revisionist Russian Marxists, those willing to work with bourgeois liberals and Democrats, were subsequently known as Mensheviks, or the minority group. But in 1903, most European socialists viewed the Russian Marxists as marginal to their own national campaigns for social reform. Orthodoxy versus revisionism. In general, in Europe's inner zone, by the turn of the century, most people who called themselves Marxists were no longer actively revolutionary. As revolutionary republicanism had quieted down in the Third 631 French Republic, revolutionary Marxism also seemed to have quieted down into the milder doctrines of social democracy. What would have happened except for the coming of war in 1914 cannot be known. Social revolutionism might have revived because real wages no longer generally rose between 1900 and 1914. And considerable restlessness developed among workers in various industries, punctuated by great strikes. But in 1914, the European working class as a whole was not in a revolutionary mood. Workers still sought a greater measure of social justice, but the social agitation so feared or hoped for in 1848 had subsided. There seem to have been three principal reasons for the decline in revolutionary agitation. Capitalism had worked well enough to raise the workers' living standard above what they could remember of their parents' or grandparents' economic situation. Workers had gained the right to vote, so they expected to benefit from new public policies, rather than from the overthrow of their governments. And they had created political parties and increasingly powerful labor unions, all of which protected their interests and helped them acquire a larger share of the national income. Marxism transformed feminism, 1880 to 1914. The campaign for women's rights also became more international and better organized during the same decades that the new workers' parties were spreading across Europe. Women received less pay than men for the work they performed in the new industrial economy, and in most places, they still faced numerous restrictions on their rights to own property, participate in political meetings, vote in elections, and attend universities. The movement for women's rights therefore continued to promote the kind of reforms that feminists had been advocating since the early 19th century, including more access to education and the right to vote. Women's groups on the continent tended to emphasize legal and social reforms rather than voting rights, whereas British and American feminists gave more attention to the campaign for women's suffrage. But activists in all industrialized societies were increasingly drawn to national and international organizations, in part because such groups created useful networks for spreading information and political ideas. American women such as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton joined with European feminists to establish an International Council of Women in 1888, and the growing demand for women's rights crossed the borders of all modern nations. Although some feminists worked to make birth control available to more women or to improve the conditions of women workers, the quest for voting rights attracted the most public attention, especially in the United States and Britain. New organizations such as the National American Women's Suffrage Association and, in Britain, the Women's Social and Political Union sponsored petitions, mass meetings, and protests that demanded equal voting rights in both local and national elections. The suffrage movement in Britain became especially militant after the British Parliament rejected every legislative proposal to grant women the vote, a pattern of official opposition that women had repeatedly challenged since the 1860s. Frustrated by the stubborn resistance of male politicians, the energetic leader of the Women's Social and Political Union, Emmeline Pankhurst, led a radical wing of the suffrage movement in a campaign of violent protests in the years before 1914. Pankhurst's supporters and allies disrupted sessions of Parliament, broke store windows, destroyed mailboxes, and damaged government, 122 buildings to protest the exclusion of women from British elections and political institutions. When arrested, the suffragettes went on hunger strikes, to which the police responded by painful, forcible feedings. Suffragettes Seek the Vote, 632. The campaign for women's voting rights became increasingly militant as early 20th century leaders such as Emmeline Pankhurst urged activists to take direct action against government institutions and facilities. This photograph of Pankhurst was taken shortly before the First World War, a transformative event that would reshape the social roles of British women and lead finally to the enactment of female suffrage in 1918. Library of Congress, Prints and Photographs Division, LCDIG GJU 12. 11123. The British campaign for women's voting rights often mobilized women for marches in the streets, public demonstrations, and confrontations with government officials. The protesters at this march in 1913 were following a woman who had been arrested at an earlier suffragist demonstration, and the presence of the police is an example of the close government surveillance that was part of every such event. Hulton Archive, Getty Images. 633 Pankhurst and other suffragettes were widely ridiculed in the British press and Parliament. But their campaign attracted growing support during the First World War, when the militant protests were suspended. And as noted earlier, British women over the age of 30 finally received the right to vote in 1918. The law was changed again in 1928, when the voting age for British women was lowered to 21. Meanwhile, women had also gained the right to vote in Germany, the United States, and other Western nations in the early years of this post-war era. The campaign for voting rights was only one component of modern feminism, however, and the movement to enhance women's rights in the economy, legal system, family, and education would develop new themes and new political strategies throughout the 20th century.